Welcome to today's episode on the Unsolved Cases, with your host, Larry Hunter, where we're diving deep into one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. A case that would forever change how we think about child safety and become the template for every kidnapping investigation that followed. This is the story of 4-year-old Charley Ross, whose disappearance on a summer afternoon in 1874 sparked the nation's first major ransom kidnapping case and launched a desperate search that would consume a family's fortune and last for decades. Picture this. It's July 1st, 1874, in Germantown, Pennsylvania. The lazy afternoon sun beats down on a quiet neighborhood where children play without a care in the world. Parents don't worry about stranger danger. Kids roam freely. But in just a few hours, that innocence would be shattered forever, and the name Charley Ross would become synonymous with every parent's worst nightmare. What makes this case truly extraordinary isn't just the kidnapping itself. It's the cat-and-mouse game that followed, the ransom letters that read like thriller fiction, and the staggering reality that, despite spending what would be over $1 million in today's money, Charley Ross was never found. And the mystery didn't die with the investigation. Men claiming to be Charley Ross surfaced for decades, with the final claimant still pleading his case as late as 1939, 65 years after the kidnapping. So settle in, because we're about to unravel a mystery that captivated America, broke ground in criminal investigations, and created the blueprint for modern kidnapping cases still used today. And if true crime like this captures your curiosity, don't stop here. Explore more twisted tales, unsolved cases, and hidden histories with Scoob, the AI-powered podcast app featuring over 1,500 expertly curated episodes from best-selling nonfiction books and real investigative reporting. Download Scoob now from the App Store or Play Store and dive deep into the story's history tried to forget. Our story begins not on July 1st, but several days earlier, with what seemed like innocent encounters that would later reveal themselves as carefully orchestrated surveillance. It was the Saturday before the kidnapping when two strangers first appeared in the quiet Germantown neighborhood, where young Charley Ross and his friend Walter played. Picture two men in a horse-drawn buggy, with distinctive red-striped wheels, pulled by a horse with a peculiar white mark on its forehead, and wearing an old harness with worn silver plating. The horse had a quirky habit. Whenever it opened its mouth and turned its head, young Walter thought it looked like it was laughing at him. It's these small, innocent details that make this story so haunting. The way children notice things adults might miss. The men struck up conversations with the boys, offering them candies. Now, Walter was a good boy who listened to his father. When he told his father about the encounter and showed him a piece of candy he'd saved for his friend Charley, Walter's father, Ross, sternly warned him against accepting sweets from strangers. It was advice that would prove both prescient and tragically ignored. But here's where the kidnappers showed their cunning. They didn't just appear once and snatch the children. No, they were patient, methodical. The next day, Sunday, as the boys walked to Sunday school, they encountered the same men again. Friendly greetings were exchanged. The warning from Walter's father began to fade from the boys' minds as familiarity bred comfort rather than contempt. Monday came, and with it, the return of the one-seat, collapsible top carriage. More candies were offered and accepted. The men were building trust, establishing a routine, making themselves part of the children's world. Meanwhile, construction workers at the nearby Boutillier house continued their work, largely oblivious to the drama unfolding on the street. Daniel Pruddy, a handyman working for the Boutillier, would later recall faintly hearing conversations in the street and catching glimpses through the foliage of men offering candies to children. Peter Callahan, the young Irish gardener, also noticed the men, particularly noting how the younger of the two always kept his head down, a detail that suggests these men were conscious of being identified. By Tuesday, the boys had become completely familiar with the distinctive buggy and its laughing horse. The red-striped wheels were now a welcome sight, rather than a curiosity. The kidnappers had successfully integrated themselves into the children's daily routine. Wednesday brought a new level of interaction. The men stopped their carriage, seemingly to fix the harness. Another deliberate move to extend their time with the children and gather intelligence. It was then that Walter and Charley noticed details that spoke to the men's financial means. The younger man's gold watch and chain, his partner's 2 gold rings, one plain, the other adorned with a red stone. But it was the conversation that day that revealed the true purpose of these encounters. The men began asking pointed questions about the Ross family. Was their mother beautiful? Was their father wealthy? Did he work daily? And when did he return home? In their childish innocence, Walter and Charley bragged about their family, unknowingly providing the very intelligence the kidnappers needed to plan their crime. The men offered barley sugar candies and mentioned hearing firecrackers in the yard, casually suggesting that the boys should buy more for the upcoming 4th of July celebration. Every interaction was calculated, every gesture designed to build trust while gathering information. The stage was now set for the kidnapping that would shock America. July 1st, 1874. The afternoon was lazy and warm, perfect for children to play outside. When the familiar buggy with red-striped wheels appeared once again, 4-year-old Charley Ross didn't hesitate. He had grown comfortable with these men over the past week. They had candy, they were friendly, and most importantly to a child's mind, they had promised to help him celebrate the 4th of July. In a moment that would haunt his family forever, Charley Ross asked the men for a ride. But he didn't just want a ride. He wanted them to purchase candy and firecrackers so he could properly celebrate the approaching 4th of July. The strangers readily agreed. After all, this was exactly what they had been working toward all week. Charley and Walter climbed into the wagon, trusting and excited about their adventure. As the horse began to trot away from the safety of their neighborhood, Charley asked an innocent question that showed he was still thinking like a child on a shopping trip. "Why don't we stop at some store to buy the candy?" The men had their answer ready. "We'll go to Aunt Susie's, where you can get a whole pocketful for just 5 cents. It was a lie, of course, but to children accustomed to adults making decisions about where to shop, it seemed perfectly reasonable. The carriage continued through the streets of Philadelphia until it reached Palmer and Richmond Streets. Here, the kidnappers executed their plan with chilling precision. Walter was handed 25 cents and directed to the corner store where firecrackers were sold. The boy, still thinking this was all part of the promised shopping trip, dutifully went into the store. But while Walter was inside making his purchases, examining firecrackers and counting his change, the kidnappers drove off with Charley Ross. When Walter emerged from the store, expecting to see his friend waiting in the familiar buggy, he found nothing but empty street. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He cried loudly, the sound of a child who suddenly understood that something was terribly wrong. Among the sympathizers who gathered around the distraught boy was Henry Peacock, a kind stranger who would ultimately reunite Walter with his father. But by then, it was too late. Charley Ross had vanished into the bustling streets of Philadelphia. Several witnesses came forward who had seen the wagon when both boys were in it. But, remarkably, none could be found who had observed it after Walter left it. It was as if the earth had swallowed the horse, wagon, and little Charley Ross. The kidnappers had planned their escape route perfectly, disappearing into the urban maze where a single carriage among hundreds would attract no attention. The immediate aftermath was chaos. When Walter was returned to his father and the story came out, the Ross family faced a parent's worst nightmare. Their youngest child had simply vanished. At first, the motive wasn't apparent. This was 1874. Kidnapping for ransom was virtually unheard of in America. Various theories emerged: family troubles, gypsies, or even the possibility that Mr. Ross himself had concealed the child for notoriety. But those theories would soon be shattered by the arrival of a letter that would change everything. and established the template for ransom kidnapping that criminals would follow for decades to come. 2 days after Charley's disappearance, on July 3rd, Mr. Ross received a letter that would chill him to his core and introduce America to its first ransom demand. Mailed from Philadelphia, the letter was barely literate but unmistakably menacing. Mr. Ross, be not uneasy, you son Charley be all writ. We has got him, and no powers on earth can deliver out of our hand. You will have 2 to pay us before you get him from us, and pay us a big cent too. If you put the cops hunting for him, you are only defeating your own end. The poor spelling and grammar couldn't disguise the sophisticated psychological manipulation at work. The kidnappers immediately established several key points. They had Charley, they wanted money, and any attempt at rescue would result in the child's death. But perhaps most chilling was their threat. If any approach is made to his hiding place, that is the signal for his instant annihilation. Initially, Mr. Ross didn't believe the letter. How could he? Kidnapping for ransom was a crime from European Gothic novels, not something that happened in civilized American cities. But the detectives who became involved in the case had a different perspective. They had to convince a grieving father that his worst fears were true. When Ross continued to doubt, the kidnappers sent a second letter that revealed just how much they had been watching the investigation. They knew about Mr. Purcell, a kind-hearted man who had offered to pay ransom. They knew about the family's desperate search efforts. Most unnervingly, they demonstrated intimate knowledge of how the case was being handled by authorities. We aren't sure whether his clothes have been preserved. We rarely visit him as we aren't responsible for his surveillance, the kidnappers wrote, revealing that Charley was being held by accomplices while they managed the ransom negotiations. However, we have seen him 3 or 4 times since July 2nd. The letter continued with details that only the kidnappers could know. In one of our letters, we mentioned that Charley hadn't been disguised in any way. At that time, he hadn't been. But since then, his hair has been cut short, and he's been dressed in girls' clothes. This detail is particularly chilling. The image of little Charley, confused and frightened, having his appearance altered to prevent identification, speaks to the cold calculation of his captors. They weren't cruel for cruelty's sake. They were methodically protecting their investment. The kidnappers also revealed their route. On the night of July 2nd, at 11 p.m., we went through Trenton, N. This was their way of proving they had actually taken the child, while providing just enough information to demonstrate their credibility, without revealing too much. But it was the psychological torture embedded in their communications that truly showed their sophistication. They taunted Mr. Ross about his friend's doubts, about the money he was spending on detectives, and about his apparent willingness to risk his child's life by involving law enforcement. Every word was calculated to increase pressure while maintaining their position of power. The letters established a pattern that would continue for months. The kidnappers demonstrating they had Charley, while simultaneously making it clear that any rescue attempt would result in his death. It was psychological warfare of the highest order, and it was being conducted by criminals who understood human nature with terrifying precision. As the investigation dragged on through the summer and into fall, the kidnappers' patience began wearing thin. By September 30th, they were ready to make their final offer, and it came with a price tag that would bankrupt most families: $20,000, equivalent to nearly $500,000 today. Mr. Ross, you've finally decided to accept our conditions, the letter began with presumptuous confidence. It would have been better for you had you accepted our demands sooner. The kidnappers were no longer playing games. They laid out their terms with business-like precision, but their business was trading human life for money. The ransom demand revealed sophisticated planning. They specified that the money should be in U.S. notes, ranging from $1 to $10 in denomination, not national banknotes. This wasn't random. Smaller denominations would be easier to spend without attracting attention, and U.S. notes were more widely accepted than banknotes. The kidnappers understood currency and commerce. They also revealed their numbers. The $20,000 will be divided among the four of us. None of us would betray the others for the entire amount, nor reveal the child's hiding place. 4 conspirators. A significant operation that explained how they had managed to keep Charley hidden while conducting negotiations. Perhaps most chilling was their cold calculation of loyalty. We have no fear of betrayal, even if the amount was $1 million. These weren't desperate criminals acting on impulse. They were an organized group with clear hierarchies and unwavering commitment to their crime. The letter also revealed their daily expenses. Our daily expenses have been at least $15 since we took your child. At a time when a working man might earn $1 a day, $15 daily suggested they were maintaining multiple safe houses or paying significant bribes to keep their operation secret. Their return plan was elaborate. Our plan is to leave your child at a minister's house at night with a label stating, "This is Charley Ross." Take him immediately to either 304 Market Street, Philadelphia, or Washington Lane, Germantown. They had thought through every detail, even including money in Charley's pocket, to compensate whoever found him. But the most revealing line was their cynical business advice. Upon recovery, put your child on display. You'll earn all your money back within 6 months, as there's not a single mother in Philadelphia who wouldn't pay $1 to see him. They understood that Charley's story would become a sensation, and his father could recoup the ransom money by essentially exhibiting his rescued child as a curiosity. This wasn't just a ransom demand. It was a comprehensive business proposal from criminals who understood publicity, commerce, and human nature. They knew they were creating America's first celebrity kidnapping victim. As autumn turned to winter, the kidnappers' patience finally expired. Their final letter, dated November 3rd from New Brunswick, carried a tone of barely controlled menace that made their previous communications seem almost friendly by comparison. Mr. Ross, it perplexes us that you're unsure about the proper name to use when communicating with us, they began, revealing frustration with the ongoing cat-and-mouse game. They suspected Ross of trying to keep them writing letters to help detectives track their movements, a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of investigative techniques. The letter revealed their contempt for the detective work being done. We're aware that the detectives are exploiting the situation for their own benefit, taking your money under false pretenses. We know how they are draining you and Mr. Lewis financially. They positioned themselves as more honest than the authorities, admitting they were taking Ross's money, but claiming they offered something valuable in return, his child. But it was the mathematical precision of their threat that was most chilling. We've kept him 100 days longer than anticipated. Now, it's up to you to decide his fate. They had been planning this operation with specific timelines, and Charley's continued captivity was costing them resources they hadn't budgeted for. Their final ultimatum was stark. If you refuse our terms, it's in our best interest that you never see him alive again. This may sound harsh, but we are prepared to carry out this act if forced to. There was no emotion in this threat. It was pure business calculation. Charley Ross had become a liability that needed to be resolved one way or another. The letter established a final protocol. Ross must send a representative to New York who would place a personal advertisement reading, "John Jonathan is staying at so-and-so." The representative must remain at the hotel until contacted. If Ross was serious about resolving the matter, the advertisement should appear in Friday's New York Herald, with the representative in New York by Saturday morning. Remember, this is our final letter to you, unless you come to New York to settle this matter, they concluded. After months of correspondence, the kidnappers were ending the negotiation phase. It was time for action or consequences. The weight of the kidnappers' final ultimatum fell heavily on Mr. Ross's shoulders. He faced an impossible choice that would define him for the rest of his life: pay the ransom and potentially encourage more kidnappings, or refuse and risk losing his son forever. Ross decided to inform his wife about the second letter, while shielding her from its most brutal threats. But when he brought the letter to the Central Police Station, he encountered unanimous opposition from District Attorney Mann, City Solicitor Charles H.T. Collis, and the assembled detectives. Their position was absolute. The ransom should not be paid under any circumstances. Their reasoning seemed logical. The main reason for the kidnapping was the ransom money. Once the kidnappers understood they wouldn't receive any money, they would release the boy. The police were convinced that the threats in the letters were empty bluffs designed to pressure the family into paying. The detectives had developed a comprehensive strategy. They were investigating within a 10 to 12-mile radius from the kidnapping site, monitoring all known criminals, especially confidence men who seemed involved in the case. Hotel registries were being examined for handwriting matches and suspicious new arrivals. The letter's handwriting was under careful scrutiny. To engage the letter writer, Ross was instructed to place a specific personal message in the next day's public ledger. "Ross, we be ready to negotiate." It was a calculated move to keep the kidnappers talking while the investigation continued. But once Ross left the central station, doubt consumed him. His son was in the hands of ruthless criminals who were tormenting him through their letters. The phrase, "you money, or his life we will have," played constantly in his mind. The kidnappers had explicitly stated that working with detectives would be futile. Only the ransom could bring Charley home. Meanwhile, the police and city authorities remained adamant that paying ransom would be a mistake. They believed the boy would be released once it became clear that no money would be forthcoming. But what if they were wrong? Charley was an innocent victim in this cruel game. How could Ross explain this gamble to his wife? Even if he could convince her, could he convince himself that this dangerous path was truly the best one? The conflict between parental love and public policy would define not just this case, but every ransom kidnapping that followed. Ross was caught between the natural instinct to pay any price for his child's safety and the logical argument that paying ransom only encouraged more kidnappings. The answer to the mystery of Charley Ross's kidnapping would come not through the ransom negotiations, but through an entirely separate crime that would expose the kidnappers' identities. Later, in 1874, police were investigating the kidnapping of a Vanderbilt child when they discovered something that cracked the case wide open: a ransom note that closely matched the one received by the Ross family. The handwriting analysis led investigators to a shocking revelation. The letters had been written by William Mosher, a fugitive convict with a criminal history. But Mosher would never stand trial for the kidnapping of Charley Ross. During a botched burglary in Brooklyn, he was killed in a shootout with police. However, Mosher's partner in crime, Joseph Douglas, was captured alive. Under pressure from investigators, Douglas confirmed what handwriting experts had suspected. William Mosher had indeed been the kidnapper of Charley Ross. But Douglas's confession came with devastating news. He claimed that only Mosher had known where Charley was being held. Douglas insisted that Charley would be returned safely in a few days. But as his own life ebbed away from wounds sustained during the burglary, it became clear that the secret of Charley's location would die with the only two men who definitely knew it. Douglas died maintaining that Charley was alive and would be returned, but he never revealed the location. The identification of Mosher and Douglas as the kidnappers solved one mystery while deepening another. The Ross family now knew who had taken their son, but they were no closer to finding him. In fact, they were further away than ever. The only people who could lead them to Charley were dead. Mr. Ross faced a heartbreaking reality. He had spent months in negotiations with criminals who were now beyond the reach of justice or plea bargaining. The careful psychological manipulation, the detailed knowledge of the investigation, the sophisticated ransom demands, all had come from men who were now silenced forever. The revelation also highlighted the terrible irony of the case. While Ross agonized over whether to pay the ransom, while detectives urged him to stand firm, while the kidnappers sent increasingly threatening letters, the window for recovering Charley alive may have already closed. The deaths of Mosher and Douglas meant that any accomplices who might still be guarding Charley would likely abandon him rather than risk exposure. This tragic turn would mark the beginning of a search that would consume the rest of Mr. Ross's life and his family's fortune. Without the kidnappers to provide leads, every possible sighting, every potential clue, every person claiming knowledge of Charley's fate would have to be investigated. The search was about to become a needle in a haystack operation that would span decades. With the kidnappers dead and their secrets buried with them, Mr. Ross faced the horrifying prospect of searching for his son without any reliable leads. What followed was a desperate, decades-long quest that would cost him $60,000, over $1 million in today's money, and consume the remainder of his life. The search attracted every kind of charlatan, well-meaning citizen, and delusional individual imaginable. Imposters began emerging almost immediately, each claiming to be the missing Charley Ross. Each claim had to be investigated, each false lead followed, each disappointed hope endured. The family became victims not just of the original kidnapping, but of the endless parade of people who sought to exploit their tragedy. One of the most persistent theories involved gypsies. The recurring narrative placed young Charley among various gypsy bands traveling through Pennsylvania and surrounding states. In Reading, Pennsylvania, townspeople reported seeing a cheerful young boy with golden curls and a chubby face among a group of about 20 gypsies, traveling with 4 wagons and 8 horses along Penn Street. The boy was spotted in the last wagon, playfully swinging a toy whip at the horses, fitting perfectly with descriptions of the missing child. His appearance drew the curiosity of townspeople who watched him. But when police intervened, they discovered the boy was older than Charley would have been. Before the gypsies continued their journey, their leader addressed the persistent rumors about child stealing. Claiming to be a genuine Spanish gypsy, he shared insights about their culture with the gathered crowd. He explained that while their ancestors in the 1700s Europe might sometimes take children to replace those they had lost, such practices were impossible in the age of telegraphs and printing presses. Running away with a stolen child would be a death sentence, he said, affirming that such old-world customs were not part of their modern society. The Public Ledger, commenting on the repeated sightings of Charley with gypsies, pointed out a crucial fact. Most people making these claims would struggle to provide verified examples of actual gypsy presence in their areas. Groups of itinerant workers or vagrants were often misidentified as gypsies, and fortune tellers would sometimes falsely claim gypsy heritage to enhance their credibility. Adding intrigue to the various gypsy tales was a story from Pittsburgh reported by the city's Gazette. A man named H.C. Carter, recognized as a journalist by the paper's business manager, N.P. Reed, had visited the newspaper office to study its archives on the Charley Ross case. Carter claimed to disagree with the New York Herald's approach to the case and was seeking a cunning detective with nerves of steel for a crucial mission. Reed was initially skeptical, but Carter's persuasive arguments and deep understanding of journalistic intricacies eventually convinced him that the man might indeed have a promising lead. Like so many others, this lead would ultimately prove fruitless, but it demonstrated how the case continued to attract attention from people who believed they could succeed where professional investigators had failed. Each false lead was torture for the Ross family. Every time hope was raised, it was inevitably dashed. Every person who claimed to have seen Charley, to know his whereabouts, or to be Charley himself, brought renewed anguish when their claims proved false. The family was trapped in a cycle of hope and despair that would continue for decades. 65 years after little Charley Ross vanished from a Philadelphia street, the case took one final, dramatic turn. On February 5, 1939, a 69-year-old carpenter from Phoenix, Arizona, named Gustav Blair stepped into a superior court and filed a lawsuit that would represent the last serious attempt to solve America's most famous kidnapping mystery. Blair's claim was extraordinary in its scope and detail. He named Walter, Sophia, Marion, and Ann Ross as defendants, accusing them of refusing to acknowledge him as their missing sibling. But Blair was clear about his motivations. He wasn't seeking money or property, as legal time limits had long since expired on any inheritance claims. His only desire was to claim his rightful name and prove his entitlement to it in court. With the confidence of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment, Blair predicted that his elder brother Walter would acknowledge their kinship within 5 years. He stated that despite his justified claims, he was constantly disregarded by Walter and the rest of his supposed family. Blair and his wife had even sacrificed their home and endured hunger in pursuit of proving his birthright. On May 8, 1939, Blair appeared before Judge G.A. Rogers in Superior Court with a jury assembled to hear his extraordinary tale. What he told them was as remarkable as any story that had emerged during the 65 years since Charley's disappearance. According to Blair, the accepted story of the kidnapping was incomplete. Yes, William Mosher and Joseph Douglas had been involved, but there was a third accomplice named John Hawks, a young Illinois farmer associated with the Mosher gang. Hawks had taken little Charley Ross after the kidnapping, disguised him as a girl, and transported him across the country in a peddler's wagon. The wagon had made a stop at a remote cabin in Lee County, Illinois, owned by a man named Rainier Miller. Hawks had sought to take Miller's 11-year-old son, Lincoln, back to Pennsylvania as a playmate for the child he claimed was his sister's daughter. Miller agreed to this arrangement, allowing Hawks to leave the kidnapped boy with them for a few days while he traveled. But during Hawks' absence, the Miller family discovered news of the kidnapping case and refused to hand over the boy when Hawks returned. This refusal, according to Blair's story, resulted in a fatal altercation that ended with Hawks' death. Fearful of being associated with the kidnapping, Miller decided to raise the boy as his own son, hiding him in a cave to avoid detection. Blair claimed that on his deathbed, Miller revealed to his adopted son that he was actually Charley Ross. Wishing to protect his foster father's reputation, the young man had kept silent about his true identity. However, his desire to reclaim his rightful name eventually prevailed, prompting him to file the lawsuit 65 years later. The story was compelling in its detail and dramatic in its scope, but like every other Charley Ross claimant before him, Blair would ultimately be unable to provide sufficient proof of his identity. The case that had begun with a 4-year-old boy asking for candy and firecrackers would end with an elderly man's failed attempt to reclaim a stolen childhood. The story of Charley Ross officially ended not with a reunion, but with a series of deaths that closed the book on one of America's most haunting mysteries. Mr. Ross died in 1897, having spent the last 23 years of his life and his fortune searching for his son. His wife followed in 1912, taking her grief to the grave. Walter Ross, the boy who had witnessed his friend's kidnapping and lived with that memory his entire life, died in 1943. The physical reminders of the case gradually disappeared as well. The Ross mansion was torn down in 1926, erasing the home where a family had waited desperately for news that never came. Today, the Clifton Presbyterian Church stands on the site where Charley Ross was kidnapped, a peaceful religious sanctuary where once children played and tragedy struck. But the true legacy of Charley Ross extends far beyond the physical locations and the people directly involved. His case established the template for kidnapping investigations that law enforcement agencies still follow today. The psychological manipulation tactics used by his kidnappers, the gradual building of trust, the intelligence gathering, the calculated threats, became the blueprint that criminals would follow for generations. More importantly, The Charley Ross case changed how American society thought about child safety. Before July 1st, 1874, children roamed freely without their parents' constant worry about stranger danger. After Charley's disappearance, the phrase, "don't take candy from strangers," became part of every parent's vocabulary. The case single-handedly created the modern concept of stranger danger and fundamentally altered childhood in America. The media coverage of the case also established precedents for how kidnapping stories would be reported, creating the template for the missing child narratives that dominate news cycles today. The Ross family's desperate search, played out in newspapers across the country, showed how public attention could both help and hinder investigation efforts. Perhaps most tragically, the case demonstrated how the lack of immediate action and the complexity of ransom negotiations could doom a victim. Modern law enforcement agencies point to the Charley Ross case as an example of why rapid response and unified command structures are essential in kidnapping cases. 4-year-old Charley Ross became more than a missing child. He became a symbol of lost innocence, both personal and societal. His disappearance marked the end of an era when children could play without fear, and parents could trust that their communities would protect their young. In losing Charley Ross, America lost something it would never fully recover: the belief that children were safe simply by virtue of being children. Today, as parents track their children's location through smartphone apps and schools conduct lockdown drills, the ghost of Charley Ross reminds us that some losses change not just individual families, but entire societies. The little boy who asked for candy and firecrackers one summer afternoon became the child who taught America to be afraid, and his legacy echoes in every Amber Alert, every milk carton photo, and every parent's protective instinct. The mystery of what happened to Charley Ross may never be solved, but his impact on American society is clear and permanent. He was the first, but sadly not the last, child whose disappearance would change everything. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting memorial for a little boy whose story refused to be forgotten. He made sure that future children would be safer, even if he couldn't be saved himself. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and this has been the Unsolved Cases. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into one of America's most enduring mysteries. The case of Charley Ross reminds us that some stories, no matter how old, continue to resonate because they touch on our deepest fears and most fundamental hopes. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others who appreciate true crime history. And remember, sometimes the cases that are never officially solved are the ones that change society the most. For even more gripping true crime and historical mysteries, be sure to explore Scoob, the AI-powered podcast app with over 1,500 expertly curated episodes on stories like this one and many more. Download Scoob today from the App Store or Play Store and keep unraveling the secrets of history, one episode at a time.